2017 is going to go down as a big year for a beloved franchise that I've sincerely loved. It inspired me as a young teen and has continued to enthrall me well into adulthood. Ghost in the Shell has successfully made entries into the worlds of comics, animated film, and television for quite literally as long as I've been alive. Starting in 1989 with the original manga published by Kodansha and written and drawn by Shiro Masamune. Oddly, the manga might be the most obscure thing from the franchise, as in 1995, Mamoto Oshii's landmark film hit theaters in a simultaneous worldwide release. It took the underground anime scene by storm, and its influence was felt strongly in mainstream hits like The Matrix, only a mere 4 years later. And yet, Oshii's work is incredibly unfaithful to its source material. While some of the characters and situations are pulled from the book, the movie takes a completely different approach with its sense of tone, rejecting the playful demeanor of many of the stories, and staying almost deadly serious with its subject matter. Yet to many people, this is considered the definitive version of this universe. When people think of Motoko Kusanagi, they don't visualize Masamune's artwork. In fact, outside of one video game, the studio that has animated every iteration of Ghost in the Shell has never come close to bringing the art style to life. Today in our comic book films and various reboots, we almost demand slavish devotion to the original source material. Marvel and DC films today are constantly scrutinized on the costumes for their villains and heroes, on whether they're faithful to the source material or not. And yet, could you imagine the uproar Oshii would have caused with his adaptation of Ghost in the Shell, were the internet as big a thing when it came to scrutiny from comic book and movie fans? The thermoptic suit from the 1995 film might not have been as embraced as warmly as it is today. The thermoptic suit is specifically only from that 1995 film and has never appeared in the original manga or any other adaptation until 2017. Which brings us the latest entry into the franchise and probably the biggest. Rupert Sanders has made a very strange film that tries to be its own thing while being a slave to the source material. The biggest influence is obviously to Oshii's work on the franchise, but there are loving nods to Standalone Complex and even Arise. It's very clear that everyone who worked on this film was familiar with the source material, one of the co-producers and executive producers actually being from Production IG.
Hey! Hey, Gabriel!
And yet, in their pursuit to make something of their own, they kind of Hollywood it up and tell a story of stolen identity, which has not really been a theme of Ghost in the Shell, at least not a character arc for the Major. By approaching the Major as the first full cyborg rather than having her be somewhat commonplace and accepted in society, the dynamic of this character changes completely. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it feels like one done out of necessity rather than one of organic storytelling. We'll touch on that later, but bear with me for a bit. In the original manga, and especially in the first film, it's heavily implied that the Major's body is not unique.
That robot, did we seem similar to you?
Of course not.
No, I don't mean physically.
There's at least dozens with a body exactly like hers, down to the last detail, like it's come off of an assembly line. Because it did. The Major's insecurities come from the fact that the only thing that makes her unique and different from someone with the exact same body or an android with the same appearance is her ghost. It's something that she can't really perceive, she just has to trust that the whispers she hears aren't replaceable or interchangeable or worse, programmable. The Major in the 2017 film is actually unique. It's revealed and repeated many times that she is the first successful human to take a completely synthetic body.
She's a miracle. A machine can't lead, it can only follow orders. A machine can't imagine or care or intuit. But as a human mind, in a cybernetic frame, Mira can do all those things and more.
The first of her kind.
Try and understand your importance, Mira. You're what everyone will become one day. You don't know how alone that makes me feel.
In this world, despite the advancements in prosthetics, no one's been able to adapt to a fully cyborg shell until Mira Killian. This changes that dynamic. Mira Killian is one of a kind. There's no one like her. So her insecurities are totally different. And yet, they're played the same.
They're not the same. Hey. It's just a robot.
She compares herself to a geisha robot, which would be more powerful if she looked anything like it. Since the Major is completely unique and no one looks like her, should she really still compare herself to that? Rather, shouldn't she be more focused on her past and if that's real? Which brings us actually to the most problematic part of the movie, her past. In the film, it's revealed that Mirakilian was actually Motoko Kusanagi the whole time, a Japanese runaway taken by Honka Robotics and stuck into a Caucasian body, which could have actually been a really compelling story point, but considering the controversy around the film, it feels extremely tone-deaf, almost to the point of self-parody. I went on record many times saying that I didn't think that the filmmakers were going to do an in-universe reason for casting Scarlett Johansson, but they did, which makes me happy, except it was handled very clumsily. Which is a shame because it starts out actually pretty strong. When Mira meets her mother, the scene is played out very well. It's a great setup to end the Major's journey very strongly. But the filmmakers don't do that. The Major embraces her mother at the end of the film, but not her identity. She simply goes back to Section 9 with her current face. Now, it sort of makes sense that she wouldn't just change her face willy-nilly because it's been repeated many times in the film, she's the first of her kind. There probably isn't an Asian body or an Asian face that she can swap out, especially since the people who would know how to do it are now dead. She was basically loaned out to Section 9 by Honka, and other than some connection with Bato, she doesn't really want to be there. She's fiercely independent, often going alone, and completely disobeying Aramaki throughout the film.
Don't go in there. It's too dangerous.
今日さ、奴は何をしてかすかわからんぞ。
Instead of going back to be with her mother and attempt to reconnect and try to find a way back to her identity, she just embraces the Major persona, as if she was just programmed for this, even making a remark that she was built for justice. The whole movie, she wants to feel human and have a secure sense of identity, and rather than choosing what's right for her, she ends up going right back to what she was built for? That rings hollow and untrue to this interpretation of the character that they've built up in the movie. I hate to bring up the first film again, but at the end of the 1995 film, and at the end of the original manga, the Major leaves. Her fierce independence and her confidence in her ghost is why she leaves the section. She wants to do things on her own terms. Even in Standalone Complex and Arise, the Major struggles to maintain that independence while relying on her team. That dynamic is absent in this film. What we end up getting is this gorgeous mess of a film from people who do love the franchise and treat it with respect, but don't understand what made it interesting in the first place. Finally, there's a large cloud that will almost always hang over this movie. There have been Americanized remakes of Asian stories before, yet very seldomly do they get accused of whitewashing. Speed Racer, Edge of Tomorrow, and The Departed specifically come to mind as Americanized remakes that were received positively by audiences, or at the very least never faced the whitewashing controversy. What did they all do differently from Ghost in the Shell? Well, in the case of Speed Racer, it's a very clear adaptation of the American show Speed Racer, not an adaptation of Makagogo, using all the American names and only making a couple of shoutouts to the original series that this was based on. The crews of Edge of Tomorrow and The Departed make those films their own, adapting them to take place in a future Europe or present Boston, and almost never acknowledging its roots. Ghost in the Shell doesn't do either of those things. Unlike Makagogo when it came over to the States, Ghost in the Shell was never turned into something else. It was simply translated and dubbed faithfully using the same characters, the same story, and so on. And this film takes place in Newport City, which is very reminiscent of Hong Kong, like the Oshii film. If it takes place in an Asian city, why is there a company called Honka Robotics creating artificial humans out of Asian kids and putting them into white bodies? Also, why is a company called Honka even run by people of American or European descent? I understand that companies with worldwide brands like Nissan happen to have Asian roots while being run by someone of, say, French descent, but in the context of the film, it seems like it's an American company that only has Americans and Europeans in high-ranking positions, and a ton of lower-ranked technicians and secretaries that are Asian. A simple thing like that comes off as even more tone-deaf. Basically, it turns all this Asian imagery into window dressing, and even important characters like Aramaki and Togusa take a back seat to characters like Ladria, who they made up for this movie. Aramaki himself is almost a fetishized version of a Yakuza boss because Beat Takashi plays him, to the point where Aramaki is willing to shoot people. That's something the character has literally never done before. I checked everywhere to see if I could find one time where he's ever shot anybody. He's only ever carried a gun a few times. He's seen carrying a gun in an episode of Second Gig, where he immediately gives it to Togusa. He has a gun in a rise and even points it, but he never fires. Even in the original manga, he brandishes a gun once but never fires. He relies on his political deals and favors in the back rooms, so his team can operate the way they want to. We unfortunately never see that in this movie, in favor of getting Beat Takashi doing what he does best. Togusa, probably one of the most important characters in the series, has almost all of his duties stripped and given to Ladria. Ladria is the one who figures out Kuze's hack in the lie detector. Ladria provides the Major with cover during a shootout. Outside of one expository scene in the briefing room, we never see him do detective work, leaving the Major to discover everything about Kuze almost entirely on her own. All these opportunities to at least ease the accusations of whitewashing and explore a transhuman world feel wasted in a movie that basically has the plot of a RoboCop. And yet, I can't hate this movie. I don't love it either. It's just kind of there. Seeing this stuff come to life is stunning, and Sanders is truly a visual artist with a unique voice when he's not aping Oshii. Everyone is giving their all in this film. No one seems to not take it seriously, which is not always the case with anime adaptations. You can tell they really wanted to do something special here, even getting Production IG as involved as possible. The politics and money of Hollywood, however, outweighed any ambitions. According to a post I ran across on the internet, and take it with a grain of salt, apparently Motoko was supposed to leave with Kuze in the original ending, similar to the ending of the '95 film. It was decided against because they wanted to make sure that Scarlett Johansson would return in the sequel. This kind of blows because it would have been a lot more in line with the character we saw in the film, the one who is a rebel and fiercely independent and takes no shit from anybody. Leaving into the net is what she probably would have done, and abandoned this body that isn't hers. It does beg the question, how does one create a successful anime adaptation in Hollywood? The investment involved has to be somewhat large to get the visuals the fans want to see on screen, but it can't be so alien that filmmakers have no idea what to make of it. I want to believe that the filmmakers involved wanted to make something great, but either they didn't understand what they had, or their bosses didn't understand what they had and tried to make it more simple. In doing so, they've remade a story they've done already. There's a quote that I think I can end this on to sum up the problem of Hollywood's thinking.
Your effort to remain